Welcome to another thrilling historical Western romance audiobook, The Widow, the Outlaw. If you are new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating historical Western romance stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. Excited to have you here again. Shall we begin? Act 1. The Drifter and the Widow. The wind carried the scent of rain and dry earth, sweeping across the Wyoming plains and rustling the tall, brittle grass. Eliza McKenna stood near the front porch of Wind River Ranch, her arms crossed tight against the evening chill. Her gaze stretched over the land that had been in her husband's family for 2 generations, now hanging by a thread. The sky darkened to an ominous gray, the weight of an approaching storm pressing down like a heavy hand. A fitting backdrop for the storm brewing in her life. Her cattle herd had dwindled, the fences stood in desperate need of repair, and the banker in town had made it clear if she couldn't produce the next payment, the land would go to the highest bidder. And that bidder, no doubt, would be Randall Sutter. Eliza clenched her jaw. Sutter had come just yesterday, sitting tall on his fine gelding, his smug expression as polished as the silver spurs on his boots. He had offered her a way out, sell the ranch, take the money, and start fresh somewhere else. A woman alone has no business running a place like this, he had said, voice dripping with false concern. She had met his cold stare with one of her own. I'm not selling. His smile had stretched, slow and confident. We'll see. Eliza shivered at the memory, though not from the cooling air. Sutter had been applying pressure for months, sending men to intimidate her, making it clear that without protection, she wouldn't last. And he wasn't wrong. Every hired hand she'd taken on had left some slipping away in the night, others openly stating they wouldn't cross Sutter. Now, the ranch was hers to run alone. A gust of wind kicked up the dust along the front yard, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Eliza exhaled and turned back toward the house, boots crunching over the dry ground. Inside, a single lamp flickered on the kitchen table, casting shadows across the walls. She paused near the doorway, pressing her fingers against the rough wooden frame. She missed the way the house used to feel warm, steady, full of life. Now it felt like a waiting tomb. She had never loved Thomas McKenna the way a woman ought to love a husband, but she had respected him. He had been good to her in his own way, teaching her the land, trusting her with decisions most men wouldn't have left to their wives. And now, 6 months since his mysterious death, she was left with nothing but uncertainty. A sharp crack of thunder split the air, shaking the window panes. Eliza turned, eyes scanning the horizon once more. A storm was coming, all right. She just didn't know if it would be the one in the sky or the one headed straight for her doorstep. The sun dipped low over Wind River, spilling gold and crimson across the sky, casting long shadows over the dry earth. The ranch had settled into an eerie quiet, save for the distant lowing of cattle and the occasional creak of the barn's weathered beams. Eliza McKenna stood near the porch steps, arms wrapped around herself as she studied the land. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of coming rain, and with it, an unease she couldn't shake. Then she heard it, the rhythmic beat of hooves striking the packed dirt road. A rider emerged from the dusky haze, moving with the slow, deliberate ease of a man who had spent more time in the saddle than out of it. He came alone, his posture relaxed, though there was something about him, something that sent a cold ripple down her spine. Eliza took an instinctive step back into the shadows of the porch. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an effortless confidence. A long brown duster trailed over his legs, coated in trail dust, the fabric worn thin in places. His hat, pulled low over his brow, shaded his features, but she could make out a sharp jawline, dark hair in need of a trim, and the kind of face that belonged to a man who'd seen his share of trouble. Her breath caught when he lifted his head. Blue eyes, pale, piercing, locked onto hers. A stranger's eyes. Unreadable. Unsettling. His horse, a sturdy black gelding, came to a halt near the hitching post. The man swung down, moving with the quiet grace of someone used to being watched. He didn't rush, didn't call out a greeting. He just stood there, studying her, as if deciding whether she was worth speaking to at all. Eliza's heart pounded. She wasn't fool enough to trust a man who appeared out of nowhere, especially one who looked like he carried ghosts on his back. But she was in no position to be turning away help either. He stepped forward. "Even on, ma'am." His voice was deep, roughened by dust and long days under the sun. Eliza lifted her chin. "You're trespassing." One corner of his mouth lifted, though it wasn't a real smile. "Didn't see a sign." "I don't need one," she said, folding her arms, trying to ignore the way his gaze held hers, unwavering. The stranger shifted, glancing at the rundown corral, the barn doors hanging uneven on their hinges, the broken fencing near the east pasture. She saw the moment he took it all in, piecing together the state of things. When his eyes returned to her, something in them had changed. "You run this place alone." Her grip tightened on her arms. It wasn't a question a man asked without reason, and she didn't care for the way it made her feel exposed, vulnerable. "I do," she said, keeping her voice steady. He studied her a moment longer, then reached up and tugged off his hat, revealing dark, tousled hair and a face lined with just enough grit and wear to prove he was no greenhorn. "Name's Jesse Thatcher. I'm looking for work." The name meant nothing to her, but that didn't mean much. A drifter's name was as good as the wind that carried him. She should send him on his way. She should tell him she had no need for a hired man, that she was doing just fine on her own. But that would be a lie, and he could probably see straight through it. The rhythmic rasp of a handsaw sliced through the quiet of the barn, mingling with the scent of hay horse sweat and aged wood. Eliza stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching as Jesse Thatcher worked with the steady confidence of a man who knew his way around a ranch. She hadn't asked him to fix the busted stall door. He'd seen the damage, grabbed a hammer, and started working without a word. That should have unsettled her. She wasn't used to men who stepped in without demanding something in return. But as she watched him work his movements sure, his attention unwavering, she couldn't deny that there was something different about him. The lantern light cast long shadows across the barn walls, highlighting the dust clinging to the sleeves of his coat. His dark hair, still damp from the ride-in, curled at his collar. Strong hands gripped the saw as he shaped a replacement plank, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with lean muscle. A man accustomed to hard labor. A man who, for all his rough edges, moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew how to handle himself. She should send him on his way. Instead, she found herself waiting. Jesse drove the last nail into place, tested the stall door with a firm push, then straightened, turning toward her. That should hold. Eliza swallowed, her gaze flicking from the repaired stall to his face. He met her eyes, waiting, patient but unreadable. "Handy with tools," she said at last, forcing her voice to stay even. He brushed sawdust from his hands. "Comes with the life," she hesitated. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. She wasn't fool enough to believe he'd come here by chance. Wind River Ranch sat too far off the beaten path for a man to simply stumble onto it. Jesse didn't fidget under her scrutiny. He didn't offer excuses. He simply waited, letting her make up her own mind. Finally, she exhaled. Supper's on the stove. His gaze lingered on her a moment longer before he gave a single nod. Much obliged. Inside the ranch house, the meal was simple stew ladled into chipped porcelain bowls, fresh cornbread, and black coffee strong enough to scrape the rust from an old wagon wheel. Jesse sat at the worn kitchen table, spoon in hand, eating with the quiet focus of a man who'd gone too long between decent meals. Eliza took the chair across from him, studying him between bites. The oil lamp cast a warm glow over his face, sharpening the angles of his jaw, the hollows of his cheeks. A man used to hunger, used to long days on the trail. used to keeping his past locked up tighter than a bank vault. She waited until his bowl was nearly empty before speaking. "Where are you from?" Jesse paused, setting his spoon down. He didn't look at her right away, as if weighing his answer. Nowhere in particular. Not a lie, not exactly, but not the truth either. She took a sip of coffee, letting the bitter heat settle on her tongue. Most men have roots somewhere. He met her gaze then, something guarded in his expression. Not me. A single response, offering nothing, revealing less. Eliza set her cup down with a quiet clink. She knew the type. A man running from something. Or someone. She should tell him to finish his meal and be on his way. Instead, she said, "You looking for work or just passing through?" Jesse leaned back, his fingers curling around his coffee cup. "Work if there's any to be had." Eliza exhaled slowly. The truth was, she needed him. With no hired hands left, she couldn't mend fences, wrangle cattle, and keep the books alone. But hiring him meant trusting a man whose past was as shadowed as the mountains beyond the ranch. Her instincts whispered a warning, but desperation spoke louder. "I can offer wages and a roof over your head," she said finally. "Room in the bunkhouse." Jesse nodded, as if he'd expected as much. "That'll do." Silence stretched between them. Eliza pushed her chair back, standing. "I'll expect an honest day's work." He stood as well, tall enough that she had to tilt her head to meet his gaze. "You'll get one." "You're one." She nodded, but unease curled in her stomach. She had just hired a man she didn't trust. A man who watched her with eyes that saw too much. A man who carried the weight of something unspoken. She had invited him into her home, and she had a feeling it was going to change everything. The first light of dawn stretched pale and golden over the Wyoming plains, painting the land in hushed, sleepy hues. Eliza McKenna stood on the porch, arms crossed against the crisp morning air, watching the man she had foolishly, perhaps recklessly hired the night before. Jesse Thatcher moved through the corral with a quiet efficiency that unsettled her. He hadn't asked what needed doing. He hadn't waited for orders. He had risen before the sun, saddled up, and ridden out to check the fences before even taking breakfast. Now, he was working the barn, shifting bales of hay, tending the horses, and fixing the trough pump that had been on its last leg for months. Eliza's mouth pressed into a firm line. She had hired him because she'd had no choice. She needed strong hands to keep the ranch running, and so far he was proving himself useful. But that didn't mean she trusted him. She sipped the lukewarm coffee she'd forgotten she was holding, her gaze tracking his movements. There was something about him, something practiced, precise. The way he handled a hammer, the way he moved in the saddle, even the way he adjusted the bridle straps on one of the horses. Everything about him spoke of a man who had spent years surviving by instinct. And instinct told her Jesse Thatcher was not just another ranch hand. He wasn't some greenhorn drifting from job to job, looking for an honest wage. He was too sharp-eyed, too quiet, too comfortable in his own skin, too dangerous. And yet, for the first time in weeks, she felt a sliver of relief. He was doing the work without complaint. He hadn't asked for more than what she'd offered. He hadn't asked anything at all. The gelding in the corral let out a snort, stomping at the ground, and Jesse turned toward the sound. That was when he saw her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. His hat sat low on his brow, shadowing his eyes, but she felt the weight of his gaze just the same. He didn't nod, didn't call out a greeting. Neither did she. She'd go back inside, start breakfast, tend to the books. But she stood there, holding her half-empty coffee cup, watching as he adjusted the girth on the saddle. Jesse was the first to break the silence. He ran a gloved hand down the gelding's side before speaking. "One of your fences is down near the west pasture." Her fingers tightened around the ceramic handle of her mug. "Is it bad?" "Needs a new post. Looks like it's been rotted through a while." She frowned. That should have been taken care of weeks ago, before her last hired men had up and left. But she hadn't had time, not with everything else she was struggling to keep afloat. "I'll fix it today," he added, like it was already decided. Eliza didn't argue. She should have been the one making that call, but Jessie had already taken the burden from her hands before she could protest. She exhaled, leveling him with a measured look. "You always start work before the sun's up." "Habit," he said, "just that." No embellishments, no explanations. She hadn't expected one. Eliza shifted, looking toward the barn. The roof needed repairs. The north pasture needed clearing. And the west fence, well, he had already seen to that problem before she even knew it existed. "You eat yet?" she asked. Jessie shook his head. She hesitated, then motioned toward the house. "I made biscuits. If you want some." He studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, touching the brim of his hat before turning toward the barn to put up his tools. Eliza watched him go, something restless curling in her chest. It was too soon to know whether she had made the right choice in keeping him on. But as the morning sun stretched higher over Wind River Ranch, she knew one thing for certain. Jessie Thatcher wasn't just passing through. And that unsettled her more than anything. The midday heat pressed down like a heavy hand, stilling the air and making the land feel as though it held its breath. Eliza McKenna wiped her brow with the back of her hand and turned toward the barn, where Jessie was stacking freshly split logs near the entrance. The steady thump of hooves on hard-packed earth pulled her gaze toward the rise in the road. Dust kicked up in lazy swirls as a group of riders approached, their silhouettes sharp against the bright Wyoming sky. Randall Sutter. Even from a distance, she recognized the way he sat his horse, too relaxed, too confident. A man accustomed to getting his way. Her pulse ticked up as she stepped down from the porch. She didn't have to glance at Jessie to know he'd seen them too. He had gone still, the way a predator did when sensing a threat. Sutter reined in his chestnut, gelding a few yards from the house, his men fanning out behind him. A well-dressed vulture with silver-threaded temples and a calculating smile, he studied Eliza with the cool patience of a man waiting for something to break. "Well now," he drawled, settling one gloved hand on his saddle horn. "I figured I'd find you out here working yourself to the bone." His eyes swept over the ranch before returning to her. Mighty hard for a woman alone, wouldn't you say? Eliza stood her ground, heart hammering. "I managed just fine." Sutter let out a quiet chuckle, as if humoring a child. "You always were a stubborn one." His gaze slid past her to Jessie, lingering. The shift in his posture was slight, just a tightening of his fingers on the reins. A small adjustment in his seat, but she caught it. Jessie straightened from where he'd been stacking wood, brushing his hands off on his trousers. He didn't speak, didn't reach for his gun, didn't give any sign that Sutter's presence was worth more than a passing glance. But something about him changed. It was in his stance, the quiet way he squared his shoulders. The sharpness of his gaze as it locked onto Sutter like a blade finding its mark. Sutter didn't like it. She saw the moment the cattle baron recognized Jessie for what he was. Not just another hired hand. Not just some drifter looking for a place to lay his head. A man who knew how to fight. Sutter's smile thinned. "You take on new help, Eliza." She didn't answer right away, and Jessie didn't move. It was as if he were waiting to see how she'd play this. "He works for me," she said finally. Sutter's horse shifted under him, sensing the tension in its rider. He gave a thoughtful hum, his gaze never leaving Jessie. "Don't reckon I've seen you around these parts before, mister." Jessie met his stare without a flicker of emotion. "Don't reckon you have." Something passed between the two men. A silent measuring. A challenge unspoken. Eliza's stomach knotted. Sutter's fingers flexed against the reins before he turned back to her, his easygoing manner returning like a well-worn mask. "You've had time to reconsider my offer. I'd hate for you to make this harder than it needs to be." Her fists clenched at her sides. "You can stop coming around, Sutter. My answer hasn't changed." The smile that crossed his lips was slow, deliberate. "Not yet." He tugged the brim of his hat in mock courtesy, his attention flicking once more to Jessie. "I hope you know what you're getting into, mister. Wind River's got a way of chewing up men who don't belong here." Jessie's voice was quiet when he answered. "I don't scare easy." Sutter studied him a moment longer, then turned his horse with a sharp pull of the reins. "Let's go, boys." The group wheeled around, heading back toward the road, dust curling up in their wake. Eliza didn't breathe until they disappeared over the ridge. Jessie walked past her, picking up a fresh log and tossing it onto the stack. "He's gonna keep pushing." She swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I know." Jessie gave a slow nod, as if weighing something in his mind. Then he turned back to his work, as if Sutter's visit had been nothing more than an afternoon distraction. Eliza stared after him, unease curling in her chest. Sutter had taken Jessie's measure, and she had a feeling he didn't like what he'd found. The ranch house had settled into the kind of stillness that came only at the end of a long day. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the distant howl of a coyote. A storm brewed on the horizon, the clouds stacking in heavy layers, though the rain had yet to come. Eliza McKenna set aside the ledger she'd been poring over at the kitchen table. No matter how many times she went through the figures, the numbers didn't change. She needed more help, more cattle, more time. But time was the one thing she didn't have. She sighed and pushed back from the table, rubbing the ache from her temples. The low glow of the oil lamp threw long shadows across the wooden walls as she stood and made her way to the front porch, needing a breath of air to clear her thoughts. That was when she saw him. Jessie sat at the edge of the barn, a small oilcloth spread across his lap. In the dim light of the lantern hanging from a nearby post, his hands moved with practiced ease, working over a pistol that gleamed dark and deadly in his grip. Eliza paused at the porch steps. She had seen her fair share of firearms. Every rancher carried one, and her husband had owned more than a few, but this was something else. That weapon didn't belong to a hired hand. She stepped off the porch, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Jessie didn't look up, but she knew he was aware of her presence. There was something about the way he carried himself, always alert, always prepared. "You take mighty good care of that gun," she said, stopping a few feet away. He didn't answer right away, just continued running the oiled cloth over the barrel, his movements precise. A man should always be prepared. Her pulse ticked up. That wasn't an answer. Not really. Eliza folded her arms. "That's not a ranch hand's pistol." Jessie finally lifted his head. The lamplight cast his features in sharp relief, emphasizing the quiet intensity in his gaze. "No," he admitted, "it's not." She waited, expecting more. A reason. An explanation. But he only studied her with that same unreadable expression, as if gauging whether she was someone he could trust. A shiver ran down her spine, though not from the coolness of the night air. Eliza wasn't a woman prone to fear. She had faced down cattle thieves, fought to keep her ranch afloat, and stood her ground against men like Randall Sutter. But something about Jessie Thatcher unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite name. She should press him, demand to know what kind of man she had let onto her land. Instead, she swallowed back the unease creeping through her and took a steadying breath. "Supper's on the stove," she said at last, turning toward the house. She didn't look back, but she felt his eyes on her long after she'd gone. Act 2. Sparks and Shadows. Days turned into a rhythm of hard work and unspoken tension. Jessie Thatcher did what needed doing without being told. He mended the broken fence on the west pasture, reinforced the barn doors before the coming storm, and handled the cattle with the ease of a man who had spent his life around livestock. More than once, Eliza caught herself watching him, admiring the quiet efficiency of his movements, the way he handled a horse as if he could speak its language, and that unsettled her. She had hired him because she'd had no other choice. That didn't mean she had to like the way she noticed things about him, the solid strength in his arms when he worked, the way his voice carried a low steadiness that somehow set her nerves on edge. She had no business noticing things like that. Not about him. Not about any man. Yet every morning when she stepped onto the porch with her coffee in hand, Jessie was already out in the corral, checking the horses or tightening the boards on the stalls. When she went into town for supplies, he had the sense to stay behind, knowing his presence would only invite more trouble. He wasn't chatty, didn't push into her affairs, but somehow, without speaking much at all, he had become part of the ranch, and she hated how much that relieved her. One afternoon, while repairing the paddock, she caught herself staring at him longer than she should have. He was shirtless beneath the heat of the sun, his tanned skin damp with sweat, muscles shifting as he drove a nail into a post with the steady strike of a hammer. Something hot and unwelcome curled in her stomach, and she turned sharply, marching toward the well to fetch water before she did something foolish like let her gaze linger. She busied herself with the task, dipping the bucket, pulling it up, but her mind stayed tangled in things that had nothing to do with work. She had been a widow for 6 months. Before that, she had been a wife to a man who had been more of a business partner than a lover. Thomas had been kind in his own way, but there had been no passion between them, no deep longing. She had never been the type to swoon over a man, never let her head get turned. So why did Jessie Thatcher get under her skin? She set the bucket down harder than necessary and took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. That night, the tension between them stretched even thinner. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, eating in silence, except for the occasional scrape of Jessie's fork against his plate. The lantern on the wall cast a golden glow across the room, shadows playing over the hard lines of his face. She knew she should say something small talk, polite conversation, but what was there to say? He was a mystery, a man who had walked onto her land with secrets in his eyes and a gun too fine for a simple drifter. And yet, she had started to trust him. Maybe not with his past, but with the ranch, with the work, with standing beside her against Sutter's men. That should have been enough. But as Jessie glanced up from his plate, and their eyes met across the table, something in her chest tightened, and she had the sinking feeling that it would never be enough. The sky had deepened into the muted hues of evening by the time Eliza McKenna and Jessie Thatcher rode into town. The ride had been mostly quiet, the rhythmic clop of their horses' hooves filling the silence between them. Eliza told herself it was the long day's work that made her feel on edge, but the truth lay elsewhere. The past few weeks had settled Jessie into the fabric of the ranch in ways she hadn't expected. He was steady, hard-working, and quick to step between her and trouble when Sutter's men came sniffing around. But trust was a fragile thing, and Jessie Thatcher was a man of too few words and too many secrets. Now, as they crossed into Wind River's main street, she caught the wary glances aimed at him from the townsfolk. The blacksmith, normally too busy to pay much mind to anyone, paused mid-swing of his hammer, eyes narrowing before returning to his work. A pair of old ranch hands near the saloon shifted uncomfortably, their conversation trailing off as they took him in. Eliza frowned, her fingers tightening on the reins. Jessie rode on without acknowledging any of it, his face unreadable, as if he had expected their scrutiny. That alone made her uneasy. A man shouldn't be so accustomed to suspicion that he could ignore it without effort. They reached the mercantile, and Eliza swung down from her saddle, dusting off her skirts as Jessie dismounted beside her. "I won't be long," she said, leading the way up the steps. Jessie followed without a word, stepping inside as she moved toward the shelves. The air inside carried the scent of leather and dried goods, the wooden floor worn smooth by years of boots crossing its surface. Mrs. Cullihan, the storekeeper's wife, barely glanced up from the counter. But her husband, a thin man with sharp eyes, did a double take when he saw Jessie. Eliza saw the recognition that flickered across his face before he quickly smoothed it away. Jessie seemed not to notice. Or if he did, he didn't let on. She busied herself gathering flour and coffee, but her attention never strayed far from the quiet tension around them. The moment shattered when the saloon doors across the street burst open. A man stumbled out half-drunk and swaying, a whiskey bottle clutched loosely in one hand. His clothes were rumpled, his boots scuffed from too many years of hard living. He caught sight of Jessie through the mercantile window and let out a rough, humorless laugh. "Well, I'll be damned." Eliza turned just as the man lurched toward the store. "Thatcher," he slurred, then stopped himself, shaking his head with a crooked grin. "No, my mistake." "Ain't Jesse Thatcher, is it?" Jesse's body had gone very still. Not tense, not defensive, just still. Eliza felt the shift in the air. The drunk let out a chuckle, his bloodshot eyes glinting as he took another swig from his bottle. "Funny thing, though, if it ain't you, then I reckon it must be your ghost, 'cause I know that face anywhere." The shopkeeper's wife dropped something behind the counter. A pin could have fallen, and it would have sounded like thunder in the sudden hush. Eliza's skin went cold. "Outlaw. Blood money." The words hung in the air, unsaid but heard all the same. Jesse didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't rise to the bait. He just stepped forward, grabbed the sack of supplies from the counter, and tipped his hat to the Callahans. "Much obliged." Then he turned and strode toward the door. Eliza hesitated only a moment before gathering her things and following, her pulse kicking up as she stepped back into the cooling evening air. Jesse had already reached his horse, securing the bundle to his saddle. He moved as if nothing had happened, as if a man hadn't just confirmed every doubt she'd had. Eliza's throat felt dry. She swallowed hard and forced her voice to stay steady. "You going to tell me what that was about?" Jesse adjusted the strap on his saddlebag, then met her gaze. His blue eyes held no surprise, no guilt, only quiet patience, as if he'd been expecting the question. "A man should always be prepared," he said simply, echoing the same words he'd given her when she'd asked about his gun days before. Eliza's stomach twisted. That wasn't an answer. That was a warning. The barn smelled of hay, leather, and warm horse flesh, the familiar scents wrapping around Eliza McKenna as she worked. The harness lay sprawled across her lap, the leather cracked from wear, the buckle stubborn in her grasp. She wrestled with it, frustration mounting, her mind still tangled in the events from town. Thatcher. Outlaw. Blood money. The words gnawed at her, stirring questions she had no answers to. She wanted to shake them off, to pretend that drunken fool's slurred accusation hadn't meant anything, but she couldn't. And yet, here she was, mending a harness instead of confronting the man who had more than one reason to lie to her. She yanked the strap harder than necessary. The stubborn leather resisted, slipping from her grasp. She cursed under her breath, pushing stray strands of hair from her face. A shadow shifted near the barn entrance. Eliza's breath caught as Jesse Thatcher stepped forward, his boots whispering over the hay-strewn floor. "You're going to tear it worse if you keep fighting it like that," he said, voice even unreadable. She stiffened. "I can manage." His gaze dipped to the harness in her lap, then back to her face. He didn't argue, didn't point out that she was losing the battle. Instead, he crouched beside her, his movements slow and measured, as if approaching a skittish horse. "Let me see." Eliza hesitated. The smart thing would be to send him on his way, to remind him that she didn't trust him, didn't want his help. But the buckle wasn't fixing itself, and her hands were shaking from something she didn't dare name. She exhaled and passed it over. Jesse took it without a word, rolling his shoulders as he settled onto the stool beside her. His hands, rough from work, moved with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything he did. He loosened the stubborn buckle with a few firm tugs, smoothing the leather like it was second nature. The lantern light played over his face, casting shadows along the sharp planes of his jaw, the strong column of his throat. Eliza forced herself to look away. A long moment passed, the barn wrapped in quiet save for the sound of Jesse working. Then, without thinking, she reached to hold the strap steady. Her fingers brushed against his. A jolt shot through her, warm and unexpected. Her pulse jumped, her breath catching before she could stop it. Jesse's hands stilled. The silence stretched, thick and humming with something she didn't dare name. Slowly she lifted her gaze. His blue eyes met hers in the lantern glow, steady, assessing. There was no smugness there, no teasing smile, no attempt to push the moment into something it wasn't. Just quiet awareness, like he'd felt it too. Eliza swallowed hard. She shouldn't feel this. Not for a man she didn't know. Not for a man who carried too many secrets in those sharp, watchful eyes. She pulled back, her fingers curling into her lap as she straightened. "Thank you," she said, too briskly. Jesse didn't move right away. His gaze lingered for half a breath longer. Then he gave a slow nod. "Anytime." He handed her the fixed harness, then stood, stepping away without another word. Eliza gripped the leather in her lap, watching as he disappeared into the night. Her pulse still hadn't settled. The first fat drops of rain splattered against the barn roof just as Eliza McKenna latched the stall door. The temperature had dropped sharply in the last hour, the smell of rain thick in the air long before the storm arrived. She had known better than to come out here with the sky rolling dark and heavy, but the horses had been restless, the shift in the air stirring them up. Now, the storm had broken loose, and the wind howled through the gaps in the barn walls, rattling the doors against their hinges. A loud boom of thunder cracked overhead, shaking the rafters. A few of the horses snorted and stomped their hooves, uneasy. "Eliza." The deep timbre of Jesse Thatcher's voice carried over the sound of the rain hammering against the roof. She turned to find him near the barn entrance, his shoulders outlined against the open doorway, his coat damp from the first onslaught of the storm. She tightened her grip on the wooden rail, steadying herself. "You have to stay inside when weather like this rolls in," he said, his voice calm, measured. Storm came up fast. Eliza huffed, brushing loose strands of damp hair from her face. The horses were unsettled. Jesse stepped inside fully, shutting the heavy doors behind him, just as another gust of wind sent a spray of water through the gap. The storm had no intention of easing anytime soon. They were trapped. Rain slammed against the roof in an unrelenting rhythm, loud enough to drown out everything else. The oil lamp hanging from the post threw a warm glow over the barn, but the space between them felt tight, charged with something that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Eliza turned away first, reaching for the brush she'd left on the ledge near the tack wall. Her fingers curled around it, though she made no move to use it. Jesse was quiet behind her, but she felt him there, too close, too solid, too present. When had she started noticing him this much? Not just as a hired man, not just as someone she relied on to help keep her land afloat, but as a man. The realization unsettled her more than the storm. Another clap of thunder shook the barn, and Eliza startled, her breath catching. Jesse was there before she could think to stop him, one hand coming up, firm and warm, resting on her elbow. "It's just noise," he said, voice low. His touch sent heat skittering through her, unwelcome and undeniable. She swallowed, willed herself to step back, but she didn't. She lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I'm not afraid of storms." His eyes held hers, steady and knowing. "No," he agreed, his voice quieter now. "I don't reckon you are." She should move. She should break whatever was happening between them, before it turned into something she couldn't take back. But Jesse was standing too close, the storm keeping them locked in, the air charged with something thick and unspoken. Another gust of wind shook the walls. Jesse didn't move, didn't look away, just stood there, watching her like he was memorizing the way she looked in that moment. And then, before she could think, before she could stop herself, she tilted her head just a fraction. Jesse's gaze dropped to her lips. The rain pounded harder. Everything inside her screamed to step back. Instead, she leaned in. The storm raged outside, rattling the barn doors, rain hammering the roof in an unrelenting rhythm. The air inside felt thick, heavy with the scent of damp hay and horses, charged with something else entirely, something Eliza couldn't name and didn't want to. Jesse stood too close, his steady presence filling the small space between them. His gaze held hers unwavering, as if he could see straight through her defenses, as if he already knew the battle she was waging with herself. She couldn't stand it. Frustration clawed at her chest, tangled with too many emotions she wasn't ready to face. The way he looked at her, calm, unreadable, patient, it set something off inside her, something reckless. "What are you really running from?" she demanded, her voice sharp. Jesse didn't answer. He didn't look away, didn't shift his stance, didn't so much as blink. That only made it worse. She clenched her hands into fists, trying to push down the heat rising inside her. You walk onto my ranch with a gun too fine for a ranch hand, with men in town whispering your name like it's tied to something dark, and you expect me not to ask. Her pulse pounded, breath unsteady. I don't know who you are, Jesse. And I don't trust a man who keeps his past locked up like a loaded gun. Still, he said nothing. The tension between them stretched, thick as the storm outside. Then, in one swift movement, Jesse closed the space between them. Before she could react, his hands framed her face, warm and rough, calloused palms skimming her rain-damp skin. His touch sent a shiver through her, not from cold but from something deeper, something she didn't understand. Eliza, he said, low and raw, almost like a warning. Then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet. It was desperate, demanding, full of heat and something dangerously close to need. A sharp inhale caught in her throat, and then, heaven help her, she kissed him back. The moment she did, something inside her broke wide open. Her hands found his coat, gripping the fabric as if she could ground herself, as if she could hold onto something solid while the rest of the world spun away. His lips moved over hers with an urgency that stole her breath, his body solid against hers, and for the first time in a long, long time she felt alive. She didn't know who let go first. Maybe it was the storm outside, the crack of thunder that jolted her back to reality. Maybe it was the sudden realization of what she had just done. Either way, she tore herself away from him, shoving against his chest with shaking hands. Jesse let her go, his breath ragged, his blue eyes darkened with something unreadable. I can't do this, she choked out, backing away. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her body still betraying her, still aching from the kiss that had felt too right for something so wrong. Jesse didn't move. He just watched her, jaw tight, chest rising and falling like a man trying to rein himself in. The storm howled outside. Inside, another kind of storm had just begun. The night stretched long and restless. Eliza lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her body still thrumming with an energy she didn't want to name. The rain had slowed to a steady patter against the roof, but inside her chest, the storm hadn't settled. She pressed her hands to her face, willing herself to forget the way Jesse had kissed her. Raw, urgent, unforgiving. The worst part wasn't that she had let it happen, it was that she had kissed him back. And Lord help her, she had wanted more. Frustrated, she shoved the covers aside and swung her feet to the floor. She needed air. Padding barefoot through the quiet house, she reached the front door and eased it open, stepping onto the porch. The night was damp and cool, the scent of wet earth clinging to the air. The storm had moved on, but the clouds still stretched heavy across the sky, blotting out the moon. She wasn't alone. Jesse sat on the edge of the porch, one knee bent, forearm resting loosely over it. A lantern burned low beside him, casting just enough light to sharpen the angles of his face. He didn't look at her, but she knew he'd heard her approach. For a long moment she just watched him. The way he sat there, silent, gaze fixed on the darkened horizon, it stirred something in her. Not fear, not even suspicion. Something softer, something she didn't know how to place. He looked like a man waiting for trouble, or maybe running from it. Finally she spoke. "Can't sleep?" Jesse exhaled, slow and steady. "Guess not." Eliza hesitated, then moved to stand beside the porch railing, arms crossed against the cool night air. "That makes two of us." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. She wanted to ask if he regretted the kiss as much as she did, but that wasn't the question that left her lips. "Where are you from, Jesse?" He was quiet for a long time. Then, without looking at her, he said, "Nowhere that matters." Her stomach twisted. It was a carefully chosen answer, too vague to mean anything, too practiced to be the truth. She should let it go. Should turn around, walk back inside, and pretend she hadn't heard the way his voice had gone a shade too flat. Instead, her gaze dropped to the gun resting against his thigh, his fingers curled around the handle. Not tightly. just enough to tell her that whatever ghost had followed him onto this porch wasn't one he was willing to name. The uneasy feeling in her chest deepened. "Everyone's from somewhere," she said quietly. Jesse finally turned his head, meeting her gaze in the dim light. His blue eyes were unreadable, guarded. "Not me." A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran through her. A man with nowhere to call home was a man with nothing to lose. And that was the most dangerous kind of man of all. Act 3. A Name from the Past. The morning air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp hay and horses as Eliza McKenna made her way toward the barn. The storm from the night before had left the ground soft, puddles dotting the packed dirt path. Everything smelled of rain fresh and new, yet her thoughts felt anything but. Sleep had eluded her, Jesse's words from the porch circling in her mind like a hawk on the wind. Nowhere that matters. It wasn't just the words that unsettled her. It was the way he'd said them, the way his fingers had curled around his gun as if expecting trouble. She pushed the unease aside as she stepped into the barn. Work didn't wait for a woman's restless thoughts. Inside, the horses stirred in their stalls, nickering softly as she walked past. She grabbed a pitchfork, determined to busy herself, but movement near the tack wall caught her attention. Jesse's saddlebag lay slumped against a wooden crate, half open from where it had likely been tossed the night before. Eliza frowned. Jesse was meticulous about his belongings. Careful. A man like him wouldn't leave something undone. With a glance toward the barn doors, half expecting to see him stride in, she set the pitchfork aside and crouched down. The leather bag was worn, creased from years of travel, the brass buckles tarnished with time. She hesitated only a moment before reaching for it, telling herself she was just tidying up. Her fingers brushed over the rough edges of parchment. Frowning, she pulled the paper free, unfolding it. The breath locked in her throat. It was old, the edges frayed and dirt streaked, but there was no mistaking what it was. A wanted poster. Her pulse pounded as her gaze traveled downward, landing on the image sketched in dark ink. Jesse's face stared back at her, but the name scrawled below it wasn't Jesse Thatcher. Jesse Callahan. A rush of cold spread through her limbs. Her hands tightened around the paper, her heartbeat drumming in her ears as she read the bold words beneath the name. Wanted for murder. The barn seemed to shrink around her, the air suddenly too thick, too stifling. Jessie had secrets. She'd known that from the start. But this, a wanted man, a killer. Her breath came quicker, uneven. She had let him onto her land, trusted him with her ranch, trusted him with her stomach twisted, heat rising to her cheeks. She had let him kiss her. She shot to her feet, the paper crumpling in her grip. The horses stirred at her sudden movement, one of them shifting uneasily in its stall. Eliza forced herself to breathe, to steady the storm rising inside her. This was her ranch, her land. And Jesse Thatcher, Jesse Callahan, had just become her problem. The house was quiet, but Eliza McKenna was anything but calm. She stood near the unlit fireplace, arms wrapped tightly around herself, Jesse's wanted poster burning a hole in her palm. She had spent the day trying to keep busy, trying to think through what she had found, but the words on that paper had followed her through every chore, every breath. Jesse Callahan, wanted for murder. She could have gone into town, taken the poster straight to the sheriff. It would have been the safest choice. The logical choice. But logic had abandoned her the moment Jesse Thatcher knew. Jesse Callahan had stepped onto her land and turned her world upside down. Now, she was standing in the center of her home, waiting for the man she wasn't sure she knew at all. The front door swung open. Jesse stepped inside, shaking rain from his hat before setting it on the peg near the door. His movements were easy, unhurried, as if he hadn't just spent the day working on her land under her roof while carrying a past that could destroy everything. Eliza's pulse thundered. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "We need to talk." Jesse stilled, his blue eyes sharpened in the dim light, taking in her stiff posture, the paper clenched in her fingers. He exhaled slowly, closing the door behind him, She didn't wait for him to speak. Instead, she strode forward and held the poster out between them, her hand steady despite the riot of emotions inside her. "I found this in your saddlebag." Jesse didn't look at the paper. His gaze stayed on her, unreadable, too calm. Eliza's heart slammed against her ribs. "Jesse Callahan," she said, voice tight. "That's your real name, isn't it?" He tipped his chin. "It is." A sharp breath left her, the admission hitting her harder than she'd expected. He wasn't even going to lie, wasn't going to make excuses or try to deny it. That should have been a relief. It wasn't. Her fingers curled around the parchment. "You're wanted for murder." Another silence stretched, heavy as a storm rolling in. Jesse didn't shift, didn't fidget, didn't show an ounce of guilt or fear. He just watched her, those piercing blue eyes seeing too much. Finally, he spoke. "Your husband wasn't the man you think he was." Eliza took a step back as if he'd struck her. "What did you just say?" Jesse's jaw tightened, his face unreadable. "Thomas McKenna wasn't the upstanding rancher you believe him to be." Her breath came sharp and uneven. "Don't you dare stand in my house and I didn't kill him." Jesse's voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something weighty and unshakable. But there are men who would have. Eliza's world tilted. She had spent months grieving a man she hadn't even truly loved, but she had respected Thomas. He had taken her in, given her this land, given her a life when she had nowhere else to go. He had been decent. Fair, hadn't he? Her hands clenched at her sides. "You expect me to believe you? I expect you to start asking questions." She shook her head, her pulse a wild rhythm in her throat. "I don't know who you are." Jesse's mouth pressed into a hard line. "You know enough." Eliza stared at him, at this man who had become part of her life in a way she had never intended. The man she had kissed in a moment of weakness, the man she had trusted with her land. The man who had just shattered the last piece of certainty she had left. The room was silent, but the space between them felt vast, like a canyon she wasn't sure they could cross. Finally, Jesse tipped his head toward the paper in her hand. "You going to take that to the sheriff?" Eliza swallowed hard. She should. She knew she should. But she didn't answer. And Jesse didn't wait for one. He turned and strode toward the door, pausing only briefly before stepping outside into the night, leaving her standing in the wreckage of everything she thought she knew. Eliza stood in the open doorway, the wanted poster crumpled in her fist, her breath coming too fast. Jesse's words still rang in her ears, hollowing out something deep inside her. "Your husband wasn't the man you think he was." She didn't want to believe him. Didn't want to entertain the idea that Thomas, the man she had built a life with, had been anything less than decent. But Jesse hadn't looked away when he said it, hadn't flinched, hadn't tried to soften the truth, and now he was leaving. The barn doors stood wide open, the storm-damp earth dark beneath Jesse's boots as he worked in quiet efficiency, saddling his horse. The saddlebag, the one that had held his secrets, was already secured. He moved without hesitation, his hands sure as he tightened the cinch, checked the stirrups. Eliza's pulse thundered. "You're running," she accused, stepping off the porch, the cool air biting at her skin. Jesse paused, his jaw tight as he glanced at her over his shoulder. "I never planned to stay." That stung more than it should have. She forced her voice to stay steady. "You think leaving now proves anything? That it makes you innocent?" Jesse exhaled, slow and measured, and turned toward her fully. The oil lamp hanging by the barn entrance cast shadows across his face, making his features look harder, more unreadable than ever. "Innocence," he let out a dry breath. "I lost that a long time ago." Her throat tightened. "Then why did you come here? Why did you take the job if you knew you'd leave?" Jesse hesitated. Just for a second. Barely long enough to catch. And that told her more than any words would have. He had never intended to stay. But he had. For her. For this land. For something he didn't have a name for. Eliza's chest ached. She didn't know if it was from anger, betrayal, or something dangerously close to loss. Jesse reached for the reins, adjusting them in his grip. "You should have never trusted me." Her stomach clenched. "I didn't." His gaze met hers, something unreadable passing through his eyes. Then, without another word, he swung up into the saddle. The horse shifted under him, eager to run. And then he was riding away. Eliza stood there long after the dust had settled, her hands clenched at her sides, the cold night pressing in. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was better off. But the truth settled deep, an ache she wasn't ready to name. She had trusted him, and she wasn't sure what that said about her anymore. The night smelled of smoke before Eliza saw the flames. She had been restless since Jesse's departure, pacing the house, staring out into the darkness as if she might catch a glimpse of him returning. Foolish. He had made his choice, and she had let him go. But then the acrid scent crept into the air, carried by the wind through an open window. It took only a second for instinct to take hold. Eliza grabbed her rifle and ran. The barn was burning. Flames licked up the dry wood, crackling and snapping as they devoured everything in their path. The horses inside screamed, their terror splitting the night. "Sutter," she breathed, fury and fear colliding in her chest. Her feet pounded against the dirt as she reached the corral. Shadows moved in the firelight, men on horseback, watching, waiting. A warning, a message. She threw open the barn doors, smoke rolling over her in thick waves. The heat was unbearable, but she forced herself inside. One by one, she unlatched the stalls, her heart hammering as the horses reared and kicked in panic. "Come on, girl," she coaxed, grabbing the lead of her husband's old mare, yanking the frantic animal toward the open door. She barely got her clear before the first beam cracked overhead, splitting with a thunderous crash. Her lungs burned. The fire had spread too fast, too deliberately. Hands grabbed her from behind. Eliza fought, twisting hard, slamming her elbow into something solid. A grunt of pain followed, but the grip didn't loosen. "Should have taken the deal," a voice rasped in her ear. She knew that voice. Frank Mercer, one of Sutter's men. She threw her head back, catching him under the chin. He cursed, staggering, and she wrenched free, raising her rifle. Another shadow lunged. Something heavy struck her shoulder, knocking her to the ground. Her gun skidded across the dirt. Eliza gasped, struggling against the weight of the man pinning her down. His sweat-streaked face twisted into something ugly in the firelight. "Boss don't want you dead," he sneered. "Just gone." The barn groaned, the roof sagging under the force of the flames. Eliza knew two things in that moment: if she didn't fight, they would take her land. And if she didn't get up, she wouldn't make it out alive. She bucked hard, kicking with everything she had. The man stumbled, giving her enough room to roll free. She clawed for her rifle, barely wrapping her fingers around the barrel before another boot connected with her ribs. Pain exploded through her, but she gritted her teeth, lifting the rifle and pulling the trigger. The shot rang out. A body hit the ground. The remaining men hesitated. She saw at the brief uncertainty. She wasn't going down easy. The fire raged higher. The barn wouldn't last much longer. Her vision blurred, her pulse roaring in her ears as she braced for another fight. And then, through the thick haze of smoke, the sound of hoofbeats cut through the night. Someone was coming? And she had a feeling the battle was far from over. The heat from the fire wrapped around Eliza like a suffocating hand, thick smoke clawing at her throat as she braced herself for another attack. The men surrounding her weren't backing down, even with one of their own bleeding out in the dirt. She tightened her grip on the rifle, ignoring the sharp pain in her ribs. She only had one shot left. If she missed, she'd be at their mercy. And she already knew Sutter's men had none. A gust of wind carried a shower of embers across the yard, lighting the night in eerie, shifting hues of orange and red. The barn groaned, its walls weakened by the flames. She had to move, had to get out of here before the fire swallowed everything whole. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats, hard and fast, pounding against the ground like a storm rolling in. Eliza barely had time to react before a shadow tore through the smoke, moving with the force of something unstoppable. Jesse. He rode in like the devil himself, his hat low over his eyes, his coat whipping behind him. In one smooth motion he swung down from the saddle, gun already in hand. Eliza had never seen anyone move like that. Calm, precise, deadly. A shot rang out before Sutter's men even had time to react. The nearest one dropped, clutching his arm with a strangled cry. Another man lunged, drawing his gun too slow. Jesse's second shot sent him sprawling into the dust. The remaining two hesitated, their confidence shaken. Jesse stepped forward, his movements unhurried, like a man who knew he had already won. "Get on your horses," he said, voice low and controlled, "and ride out of here before I change my mind about letting you go." One of them, the taller of the two, spat onto the ground, face twisted in defiance. "This ain't over, Callahan." Eliza's breath caught. Callahan, not Jesse Thatcher. Jesse Callahan. The name from the wanted poster. Jesse didn't react. If anything, he looked bored. Tell Sutter if he wants this land so damn bad he can come get it himself. The threat settled heavy in the air. The taller man hesitated a second longer, then jerked his head toward his companion. They climbed onto their horses and tore off into the night, disappearing into the smoke and shadows. Eliza exhaled, her legs suddenly weak. The fire crackled, eating away at what was left of the barn, but all she could focus on was Jesse standing there, gun still in hand, chest rising and falling in measured breaths. She swallowed past the tightness in her throat. "You came back." His gaze met hers, unreadable. "Had a feeling." That was all he said. No explanation, no justification. But she had just seen what kind of man he really was. No ordinary ranch hand, no ordinary drifter. And despite everything, the fire, the fight, the truth, she was still struggling to understand, her heart hammered for an entirely different reason. Because Jesse Callahan had come back, and she wasn't sure what that meant for either of them. The fire had nearly burned itself out, leaving the barn a blackened skeleton of charred beams and smoldering ash. Smoke still hung in the air, stinging Eliza's lungs as she surveyed the wreckage. The horses were safe, the remaining structure too damaged to salvage. But it wasn't the loss of the barn that had her insides twisted. It was the man standing a few feet away. Jesse Callahan. She watched him as he crouched near the trough, dipping his hands into the water, washing away the blood that wasn't his. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, dust and soot clinging to his skin, but he didn't seem to notice. Eliza knew she should speak, should demand answers, but her tongue felt too thick in her mouth. She had just watched this man fight with the skill of someone who had seen death up close, and didn't fear it. She had just heard Sutter's men call him by a name she was never meant to know. And now she stood here, waiting for the words that would either break what little trust remained or confirm what her gut had been telling her all along. Jesse dried his hands on his pant leg before straightening, meeting her gaze across the few feet of dirt and ashes between them. "I figure you have questions," he said, voice even. Eliza forced herself to breathe. "I found the poster." His jaw tightened, but he didn't look surprised. "I figured you would." She swallowed. "So, it's true? You're Jesse Callahan," he said, like he was resigned to the weight of it. She sucked in a breath, forcing her voice to stay steady. "And you're wanted for murder?" A pause. Then no. Eliza blinked. "No." His blue eyes held hers, steady, unwavering. "Not the way you think." The wind shifted, pushing smoke through the yard, making her eyes sting. Or maybe it wasn't the smoke at all. She squared her shoulders. "Then tell me. The truth, this time." Jesse exhaled, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck before dropping his arm. "I was an outlaw. A long time ago." His voice was calm, measured, as if he'd accepted this truth about himself a long time ago. "But that poster Sutter's men, it ain't the whole story." Eliza's pulse pounded, her grip tightening at her sides. "Then tell me the whole story." His gaze dropped for a moment, like he was choosing his words carefully. When he looked back up, something unreadable moved in his expression. "I used to ride with a gang," he admitted. "I was young, stupid, thought I had no other choice. But I got out. I left that life behind." Eliza frowned, waiting. Jessie's mouth pressed into a hard line. "I became a bounty hunter." Her breath hitched. Of all the things she expected, that wasn't one of them. Jesse's voice stayed steady, but something shifted in his eyes. "I took a job. A man needed killing, and someone was willing to pay for it." His gaze darkened. That man was Thomas McKenna. The ground beneath her might as well have cracked wide open. She sucked in a sharp breath, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "You came here to kill my husband." Jessie didn't move, didn't look away. "I was hired to, but I walked away." The words rang in her ears, sharp and unforgiving. She felt sick. He had come here to kill Thomas, to take a life, as if it were just a business transaction. And yet he hadn't. She shook her head, heat rising behind her eyes. "You expect me to believe that? That you just walked away?" Jessie's expression remained unreadable. "You don't have to believe me, but it's the truth." Eliza's chest tightened. She wanted to call him a liar, wanted to scream at him, but something in his face, something in the way he said it, without hesitation, made her hesitate. She swallowed hard, but Thomas still ended up dead. Jesse's jaw ticked, his fingers curling at his sides. "Yeah," he said quietly. He did. A cold chill swept over her, stealing her breath. It had been 6 months since Thomas had died. The official cause had been an accident, a fall from his horse, his head striking a rock. But now, standing here staring into Jessie Callahan's eyes, that explanation felt paper-thin. Her stomach twisted. Had someone else finished what Jessie had refused to do? Her pulse roared in her ears, her emotions colliding like a runaway stampede. She had let this man into her home, trusted him, kissed him. And all along he had been keeping this from her. The betrayal stung so deep she could barely breathe. "You should have told me," she choked out. Jessie didn't speak for a long moment. Then, softly, "Yeah, I should've." His honesty, his regret, didn't make it hurt any less. She turned away, blinking hard against the rush of emotions threatening to consume her. Behind her, Jessie stood motionless, waiting. But she had nothing left to say.